Happy Bitcoin Wednesday, freaks. It's your boy Odell here for another Citadel dispatch. I know it's been a few weeks. Apologize for that. I have been on the road. I did bring my podcasting equipment with me, but the opportunity never presented itself to have a nice in-person conversation. I hope you freaks have been enjoying the Bitcoin review episodes I've been doing with Justin Moon and MVK that are on the feed. It seems like we've gotten a lot of good feedback on those. So fortunately, I did get a bunch of those out over these last few weeks, but it's good to be back with you all for another proper dispatch. Citadel Dispatch is a live interactive show focused on Bitcoin and freedom tech. It is supported by you guys, no ads, no sponsors, 100% audience funded. And I really appreciate you all for continuing to support the show. The easiest way to support the show is to subscribe on your favorite podcast app by searching Citadel Dispatch. Or we have a new YouTube channel. You shouldn't use YouTube. You shouldn't use Google products, but a lot of freaks have told me that they want it on YouTube. So I put it on YouTube. If you use YouTube, consider subscribing there. That does help. Supposedly, I cannot get a custom channel name until I have 1,000 people subscribed on YouTube. So if you like YouTube, you can be part of that change. Also, this show runs on sats. Got to pay the rent, got to pay for these mics. So I appreciate all the support you guys give me in terms of that. The easiest way to support the show with sats is citadeldispatch.com. We have a BTC Pay server instance there. You can pay with Lightning or on-chain. You can also support the show via Paynim. My Paynim is Odell. Very easy to remember. Paynims are supported on both Samurai Wallet and Sparrow Wallet. And finally, a lot of freaks have been enjoying Podcasting 2.0. You can support the show via various Podcasting 2.0 apps, such as Fountain Podcasts, Breeze Wallet, and Podverse.fm. So if you're doing that, thank you again for doing that. Supporting the show and Podcasting 2.0 is as simple as searching Citadel Dispatch in your favorite Podcasting 2.0 app, pressing the subscribe button, choosing how many sats per minute you think Dispatch is worth it to you. And then as you listen, it automatically streams sats from your Lightning wallet to my Lightning wallet. It's pretty cool. I get to see the flow as that is happening. You can also do something called a boostergram. Boostergrams allow you to attach a message to a single payment of sats. And as is tradition, I read the top 4 boosts from the previous episode. We have Kobe with 10,000 sats saying, "Great show. Keep it technical, freaks. Fiat price is a distraction." We have Letter 6173 with 7,777 sats saying, "You have saved lives with such great content. Thank you for all the years." We have Provoost at 5,000 sats saying, "Lorem ipsum Satoshi dimsum." I think you got a kick out of that one. And then we have John Bayo with 4,444 sats. "This was a fantastic episode, super in-depth and entertaining as hell. Payments is a really complex challenge, and the more educated and informed the end user is, the better. I think the best way to educate users is through the wallet interface, like how Sparrow Wallet displays the visualization of inputs and outputs. This is what separates Bitcoin-only wallets from other multi-coin wallets. Just need to find the right balance of informing the user without overwhelming them with too much info. Reminder that if you do a boost or stream sats through Podcasting 2.0, your sats also go directly to open source projects that are awesome, that are being worked on by teams based on donations. So you got Raspberry Blitz, RoboSats, Seed Signer, Sparrow Wallet, and Zeus. So if you support Dispatch, you support those shows at the same time, which is pretty fucking cool. Last but not least, before we get started, sorry for the slightly longer intro than usual. I'm a little bit rusty here. Shout out to all the freaks who continue to join our live chats while we broadcast. So if you subscribe on YouTube or Twitch, you'll get notified when we go live. If you open up those streams, your live comments show up on Citadel Dispatch. They're not censored. There's probably some kind of algorithm that stops some of your comments from coming through, but I don't block any comments from coming through. And it's a key aspect of this conversation. So you're able to be a part of the conversation. We're able to answer your questions. We're able to react to your comments. If you don't want to use a tech platform We have a matrix chat available, which has great conversation. We have over 1,000 Bitcoiners in there right now. Great conversation on a daily basis, even when the show isn't live. You can find a link to that at citadeldispatch.com by clicking the citadel.chat button. Okay, guys. Anyway, with all that said, we're going to keep today's rip very tight. Kind of happened last minute, so I want to thank our guests for joining us. A lot of things have gone on this last week, particularly in the privacy world. We had the major news was we had this Ethereum privacy tool called Tornado Cash, was sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury, and all Americans or anyone who lives in a country that honors American sanctions are forbidden from using it as a result. Their GitHub account was pulled. The lead devs' GitHub accounts were pulled. The website appears to have been seized. The website front end appears to be seized. And a bunch of other things have gone down, which we will get into. So anyway, we have two return guests here. We have Tony. What's going on, Tony?
What's up, guys? Happy to be here.
And we have Seth for privacy here. How's it going, Seth?
Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me back on, man. Lots of interesting stuff to talk about today.
Thank you guys for joining. I literally messaged them both this morning. I have a massive Bitcoin meetup in a few hours. And this morning I woke up and I was like, I would like to talk to Tony and Seth about all this news. So once again, huge shout out to them for joining us. I think before we get started, it's important to say that first and foremost, nobody in this conversation is advocating for people to evade sanctions. You should follow all applicable laws in your country. Okay, so where do you guys want to start after that?
No, that's kind of it. That's the show, guys.
Follow, subscribe. See you later.
I don't know. I mean, at least maybe just a little bit of a summary for maybe the guy in the coma that just woke up. What's interesting, Tornado Cash, this sort of like privacy tool on Ethereum, a smart contract, that basically allows people to have some privacy, to achieve some privacy, sort of like, and I don't know how it technically operates, to be honest, but you can kind of, say it's some sort of I'm going to say coin join, but it's not actually coins that's going on here. Ethereum operates on
a privacy tool.
I know, but the whole purpose of it is to achieve privacy, right? And there's nothing wrong with trying to achieve privacy, especially, there's a lot of legitimate uses of it. There's a lot of legal uses of it. Like people have the right to achieve privacy. So that said, the United States made the argument that North Korea is using this tool on Ethereum. And it got sanctioned, and so I'm conflicted on this for like many reasons. How centralized is Ethereum anyways? So like, is this just akin to saying it's in a centralized mixer? And Ben Carmen's in the chat saying it is a centralized mixer, but hosted on Ethereum rather than a server. And that's where I'm kind of going to agree with on him.
There's two terms here. Look, if we're going to provide context, we need to provide clear context, I think. And I think all three of us are not, necessarily that familiar with, how the Ethereum ecosystem works. I think I'm
pretty familiar with Tornado Cash. If you want me to give a quick intro as to what it is and how it works.
Yeah. That would be great. But before we do that, there's two key terms that I think we're going to keep coming to, and that's centralized and custodial. Centralized is obviously you have a centralized entity that is involved in the process. Custodial, on the other hand, is also obviously is a subset of centralized or centralized. Yeah, it's a subset of centralized, but it takes it a step further, and that centralized entity also has custody of your funds and can take your money. my basic understanding of Tornado Cash is not a custodial mixer, but it is centralized. And with that, Seth, you can either disagree with that premise or just give us better context in general.
Yeah, I think you're really close. I know that there's a lot of Ethereum hate. Obviously, there are lots of good reasons for that. But I certainly would argue that it's a decentralized, non-custodial privacy tool. It's not a mixer, so people can think of it more like Zcash on Ethereum. It uses essentially the same technology, something called zk snarks, to hide amounts and to hide the input in any given transaction, so that within Tornado Cash, in each denomination in the old smart contract, so like 0.1 ETH, any output could have been any of the inputs in the pool of all time. And in the new smart contracts that they have, it's also not fixed denominations. So any output could be any input at any point in time. So you gain strong input hiding and amount hiding within that smart contract. And it's decentralized in the sense that it runs on Ethereum. The creators of the smart contract have no control over it. They cannot edit it. They cannot roll it back. They can't stop it. And I think we can get into that more, but I think that's a big reason why sanctions was the route taken here instead of legal action against the actual creators of the project of Tornado Cash. But I would argue that it's a decentralized, non-custodial privacy tool because Tornado Cash also obviously never gains custody of funds. Essentially, when you use Tornado Cash, you send in Ethereum, you get a private note, which is essentially a private key to that specific input, and then you can use that private note to claim that input at any point in the future. So the general flow is you deposit funds, you wait for some amount of time, and you withdraw funds to a different address. There are a lot of problems with that, and most people using Tornado Cash have shot themselves in the foot and ruined their privacy by going back to an old address or linking their old account and the new account together at some point in the future. There's lots of ways that can go wrong. But I think it is at least in the way that Ethereum is theoretically decentralized, this is theoretically decentralized. And I think it may be a good showing that it is decentralized, that the U.S. government has not shut down the smart contract. And
right, the smart contract's still going.
Mm-hmm.
The front end is down, and the centralized GitHub repo's been pulled, but the smart contract's still going.
Yep, and the other latest censorship is that the main API providers within Ethereum, since most people and most services don't run their own Ethereum nodes, like Infura, I can't remember the name of the other one, but Infura specifically, Alchemy, yeah. Both of them are preventing the use of their API with the Tornado Cash smart contract. So even though the smart contract is there, it's getting harder and harder for people to actually access it unless they run their own Ethereum node, which, as we all know, almost no one runs an Ethereum node.
So that means the actual end users have to run a node. I was a little bit confused on that aspect of. Apparently, there's like some kind of nuance there that it's like the specific Tornado Cash Infura nodes are down, but not if you use a separate Infura node or something.
So if you're using a wallet that uses the Infura API set, or if you're trying to use Infura directly, you can't interact with the Tornado Cash.
Got it. Okay, so that's what I thought.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I mean that just goes back. There's a lot of a lot to unpack here, but that obviously goes back to why it's so important that users can easily and cheaply run and use their own nodes, rather than relying on large companies that are hosting them on corporate cloud servers. Just to go back, I'm trying to figure out the best way to do this. Just to go back. You made the claim that it's at least theoretically decentralized. I think everyone agrees it's non-custodial. There's no like admin keys or anything that you know of that can just shut down the whole thing.
Not that I know of. From my understanding, the way Tornado Cash was deployed, once it was deployed, they have no control over the smart contracts.
Okay, so they did it the right way.
Yeah, a lot of smart contracts on Ethereum always have like this upgrade path where like the admins can kind of get in there and change the code, but sounds like that's not the case this time.
Okay, so and then we have so the reason why the custodial thing is important. Let's start with that. The reason the reason the custodial thing's important is because there's very established precedent that the U.S. government specifically believes that custodial mixers are criminal in nature. We've had multiple custodial mixers get shut down. We've had Helix. The main guy got arrested over it. He's in jail right now.
He's actually not in jail. He works.
Is he really not?
Nope. Yeah, he works for the feds now.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
What was his name again? Larry
Dean
something?
Harmon. Larry
Dean
Dean Harmon. Yeah.
Oh, is it Larry Harmon?
I think his full name is Larry Dean Harmon. Some people refer to him as Dean, some as Larry. But yeah, he took a plea deal and is now a CI for the FBI.
Wow. Okay, did not know that. And he also ran some custodial Lightning wallet that got rug pulled in that case, but that's besides the point. I guess Blender.io did not get shut down, but they got sanctioned, right?
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, these custodial mixers have historically, there's precedent been set that they're treated as criminal entities. I don't know of any cases where users specifically have been had cases brought against them, but the operators have. And so since those situations have happened, and it's important to keep in mind that in Bitcoin land, and we're going to keep bringing this back to Bitcoin and maybe Monero a little bit. In Bitcoin land, we've had custodial mixers since almost the very beginning. Like the first iteration of Silk Road had a custodial mixer built into it. That was the main way people used to achieve better privacy on Bitcoin. And not only was it a regulatory point of failure, but also obviously you have to trust the entity running the custodial mixer with not only your funds, you have to hope they don't rug pull you, but you also have to trust them with your privacy. And as a result, what you saw a lot of times with people using custodial mixers is that they would basically daisy chain them and go between multiple different custodial mixers. So since then, in Bitcoin land, we've had two main centralized coin join protocols get developed. One is Whirlpool, and then the other one is Wasabi. And both of those, the actual protocols are very different, but the key similarity is they both rely on this blinded centralized coordinator, where the coordinator is not able to link the inputs and the outputs, so they're not able to directly compromise your privacy. And they don't actually take custody of your funds. They just construct a collaborative Bitcoin transaction between the participants, and they're there to help you construct that transaction. It's a communication method. Now, when I said they can't necessarily take away your privacy, both those systems have Sybil-resistant mechanisms. The Sybil idea is if you flood an anonymity set with a bunch of your inputs to see, try and break down, with a decent amount of probability, process of elimination, what the other UTXOs are. In both of these setups in a low-fee Bitcoin environment, which is what we've been seeing, as you can see on screen if you're watching, Wiz's mempool is showing 1 sat per byte confirms in the next block. There's no Sybil resistance from the coordinator. So presumably if the coordinator wanted to be an active attacker, they could compromise your privacy. But by design, the way it's set up is if they're not actively attacking you, if they're not a malicious entity, they can't link your inputs and outputs, and they can't steal your funds. Now, this is the first case that I'm aware of where a non-custodial privacy tool that is essentially just code running on Ethereum has been sanctioned, which is a big step. That's a big leap that we've seen from the U.S. Treasury, right?
Yeah, I think we've seen this continued crackdown on privacy tools on cryptocurrency, but like you mentioned, the easy ones to go after legally have been the custodial centralized mixers, because it's a person or central entity running this thing. They custody all funds, so it's very easy to hit them with money laundering charges, and there are a lot of easy ways to bring legal action against them. And I think that's why we've seen things like Helix not be sanctioned, because they could just go after the operator, force them to comply. and bring all of these charges against them. But the big change here is like they've gone from things like Helix, which are completely centralized and custodial. They sanctioned Blender.io, which I think they sanctioned that rather than other legal action because it's most likely run out of Russia. So they don't have the legal jurisdiction to shut it down, but obviously want to prevent people from using it. And then now, like you mentioned, the big change is this kind of brings a lot of other privacy tools into the sites of the US government. Because the thought process, I think, for many people was if the thing is open source, if the thing is decentralized, if the thing is non custodial, there's not a legal case to be brought against the tool because you're not actively facilitating anything. You have no control over who specifically is using your tool. So in theory, you couldn't be like under the gun for KYC AML laws or money laundering or Banking Secrecy Act or all of these things that are normally brought against centralized mixers and happened in the past. But obviously with Tornado Cash, this is at least theoretically decentralized, non-custodial privacy tool that the Tornado Cash people have no ability to not only see who's using it, but to prevent anyone from using it, to control who uses it, or to shut it down. So there's a big difference here. And not only, like you mentioned at the beginning of the show, did they sanction the specific tool and the usage of that tool, but they went after the code and everyone who wrote the code as well, which is another massive leap because it's not just the people who are operating something and making money off of the service, but it's also just open source contributors who have contributed on GitHub are getting their accounts shut down or suspended. Like you said, all GitHub repos are shut down. So there's a massive set of precedents being set here that could have broad implications for other privacy tools on Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. I mean, even something like a Samurai wallet, in theory, could fall under sanctions if Tornado Cash could. Obviously, they have a lot of things in place where they think that they're prepared for that and they have a kind of a plan, but it I think should bring into question this idea of app level privacy and how tenable that will be in severe adversarial environments like we obviously are entering now. Like I think since the Freedom Convoy, this is the biggest piece of news in the cryptocurrency privacy space, and should be shaking everybody up and forcing a lot of really good conversations right now. And I think thankfully it does seem to be doing that.
Yeah, I'd just like to add on here that, like, I think you guys have brought it up, but like the idea is that like sanctions are basically the last thing that they can sort of do to quote unquote not stop it, but limit it in any way. So, instead of thinking of it as like they're going after the creators, they're really just trying to make it illegal to interact with a person or a service or a website or things in that nature. Like as an American citizen, they're just deeming it illegal to interact with it. As an American business or anyone following United States sanction laws, they're making that illegal to assist in any way. So, I mean, GitHub has, shut down GitHub accounts and code that has been created by Iranian coders before. Like, it's not a new thing of GitHub shutting down the accounts, and it's not necessarily it's not necessarily saying that anyone did anything wrong, that those accounts have done any criminal or illegal behavior, right? Like, they can't really go after, or they don't seem to have gone after the creators for doing anything illegal. It's just like they're trying to make it now illegal to interact with it. And it seems as though that's about as far as they can go, but it's a big sweeping measure. Like anyone in the United States interacting with it, they're now facing up to like 30 years of jail time, right? So it's a very big, serious thing for anyone that has been using it or has used it or continues to use it. But it's kind of an interesting dilemma. I think you guys are right. Like, this is basically all that they can do under the assumption that Ethereum is sufficiently decentralized enough.
I mean, I will echo the sentiment of Seth that, I think this should be making people think and have conversations. And it seems like it's, at least I've long held that like my optimistic case for people caring about privacy is that people get burned, and as they get burned, they learn by essentially touching the stove. And it does kind of seem like this is what's happening in this situation, maybe even more so than the Freedom Convoy. And the Freedom Convoy, I was a little bit disappointed how quickly everyone just forgot about any kind of lessons that could be learned from that government action. I will say that one of the most dirty aspects of using sanctions as a tool here is it does have a massive chilling effect. Most people will not want to talk about these kind of things publicly. As some of our listeners probably have already noticed, the three of us are, well, Seth actually speaks quite eloquently and carefully, but me and Tony are pretty frank about how we speak, and on this topic, we are clearly watching our words. There was that one Ethereum developer, Virgil, who got charged with sanctions violations for giving a speech. Now, he did go to North Korea to give the speech. He literally went to a sanctioned country and gave them a speech about how to circumvent sanctions. So, I mean, that's not like the most crazy case, but it's a perfect example that people that do talk about these things do put themselves in enhanced legal risk, which is a very dirty element of the whole thing. I would also say that I strongly believe that code is speech and is protected by the First Amendment. And I believe that financial privacy is protected by the Fourth Amendment. I do not think that we can rely on our legal protections. Otherwise, none of this would be necessary in the first place. But it is an important aspect to keep in mind here. Seth mentioned Samurai Wallet. Samurai Wallet did release something on Telegram talking about how they're thinking about this. There's a lot to unpack here. We are going to try and keep this episode as tight as possible. He goes, there isn't a starting point address to sanction in Whirlpool. The addresses all belong to users, so they would need to go after either software distribution or end users. Our domain, they have others. See how Pirate Bay handled their domain seizures over the last decades. GitHub, they have a self-hosted GitLab on their own hardware and a very strong privacy-preserving jurisdiction that has a history of telling the U.S. to get stuffed when they attempt to seize servers. And they have backups and can deploy to a new server almost instantly. He goes on to say he respects what TC have done, and obviously it must have worked because they did incredible volumes. Their volumes, I believe, are over $7 billion worth. So they were significantly larger than any of these Bitcoin privacy tools. But a UTXO model is far superior than an account model. Third, code is protected speech. This is a long established precedent thanks to the original cypherpunks who fought this battle decades ago. It should be evident to anyone watching that we have been thinking about these possibilities for a long time. It is why we migrated away from GitHub years ago. It's why we rely on as few third-party services as possible. It is why we set up in jurisdictions that have a history of protecting privacy. We do not bury our head in the sand hoping everything works out. We take proactive steps as early as possible. I'll end with a promise. If some aspect of our software were to be sanctioned by the U.S., we would fight that tooth and nail. We have a legal team on retainer ready to go. We'd rather put that money into development, but if it needs to be done, it needs to be done. So that was Samurai Wallet statement on this situation. Any thoughts there? There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, I definitely, it is a little bit of a different situation, which is a good thing. I'm pretty confident in the abilities to like kind of mitigate, some of these denials, like them hosting their own GitLab and having failover safes and stuff like that. And I will say, like, at the end of the day, there is a point of contact that there is to have with some of the Whirlpool servers. I'm sure they have failovers and redundancy and things like that, but there is though, a potential target point, even if it's distributed, even if they're able to have as much redundancy as possible, there is still opportunities to go after them. And I think when we talk about, code is free speech. Ideally, there isn't a centralized coordinator at all. Ideally, there's, if you were to look at like Bitcoin itself, like, there's not this centralized coordinator, orchestrating transactions. There's sufficient distribution across the entire Bitcoin network. So like, having sanctions on Bitcoin versus having sanctions on an Ethereum, privacy smart contract or a centralized coordinator, they're all kind of different stories. But I will say though, they are actively thinking about it, because there is actually this point of attack that unfortunately the United States could go after if they chose to.
Yeah, and I think Matt hit the nail on the head mentioning the kind of the psychological and chilling effect that sanctions can have. And I think if you think about what sanctions actually are and what they do, I think that's really the broadest effect, is that it scares people off from doing a specific thing. And in this case, it's using Tornado Cash or writing code for Tornado Cash, which both of those are a big deal. But I think the psychological impact is the biggest power that the government sees that they have in a sanction, um, action. And so that's one of the reasons why they're using this when they don't seem to be able to technologically shut it down. And apparently they weren't able to trace funds well enough through it, to feel comfortable in tracking down people after usage. So
Yeah, I mean, it
I
kind
think,
of proves that it works, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, if something gets sanctioned, it proves that they can't take it down and that they obviously can't manage it well enough for their own needs. And in this case, I mean, there's so much to get into in this, but I think one of the really interesting things is that they, in their official press release, the U.S. Treasury claims that all of the lifetime volume of Tornado Cash counts as laundering, which is fascinating. And that's a very big step from the previous ways that they've approached these types of tools. Even though they specifically call out only 7% of the volume over the lifetime as being from hacks that they've specifically tracked as going into Tornado Cash. So again, I think it's interesting
So
that even with
anyone who's ever used Tornado Cash was complicit. Is that what you're saying?
that is what they say. So to quote them specifically, they say, today, U.S. Department sanctioned virtual currency mixer Tornado Cash, which has been used to launder more than $7 billion worth of virtual currency. And the lifetime volume of Tornado Cash is 7.6 billion. So obviously, they're referring to the lifetime volume of Tornado Cash and saying that all transactions that have gone through Tornado Cash are, in their eyes, money laundering, which is a very big deal because, again, it's theoretically decentralized and non-custodial. And it's not like a mixer where you have direct connections to other inputs, even if the output is obfuscated. So there is a lot to unpack there, but I think it's very telling that they claim that all of it is laundering, but they can only trace a very small portion of it to illicit activity, and yet still sanction not only the tool itself, but developers, GitHub accounts, and all of the GitHub repos, and the website and documentation sites, and all of these other things.
Yeah, I mean, there's another element here that, obviously on this show we talk about Bitcoin privacy a lot. With Ethereum, there is a lot of differences between Ethereum and Bitcoin. One of the main differences is this idea of an account model versus a UTXO model. So in Bitcoin, you're told not to reuse addresses. Every time you receive Bitcoin, you use a new address. All those UTXOs, all those unspent transactions are sitting in your wallet. They almost look like bills in your wallet. Or you can imagine them as bills in your wallet of different denominations of Bitcoin. And when you make a spend, you're basically taking out a certain amount of those bills and you're making the spend. You're combining them on the input side, and then they result in either one output or two outputs usually. If you overpay, it's two outputs because they pay the change back. If you send it all, then it's one output. There's obviously other transaction types. With Ethereum, from a Bitcoiner point of view, the way you can imagine it is that everyone is using a single reused address. They call them accounts. And as a result, those accounts have your entire financial history is attached to those accounts on the Ethereum blockchain, completely viewable to everybody. That includes all the different tokens and everything else you do in Ethereum is all attached to that one account. Now, those accounts are often obviously linked to your identity, and sometimes they're linked to your identity. Well, the majority of the time they're linked to your identity because most people that are coming into this ecosystem come in through KYC regulated institutions. So they're coming in, linking it to their identity. But also, a lot of people on Ethereum have voluntarily linked it to their identity. So we have addresses, accounts, they call them accounts. We have accounts on Ethereum of known individuals with their full financial transaction history, including all tokens and all contracts they've interacted with, immediately viewable to anybody with access to the chain. Or if you don't have access to the chain, you use one of these third parties like Etherscan or something, and you can see it. So what is that implication here? Well, the implication here is, first of all, when they made the sanction, they sanctioned the contract's account. So anyone who interacts with that account is connected to that. This is a single account. This is what when Samurai mentioned in their statement, they mentioned the UTXO model versus the account model. This is what they were referring to. But the second thing is, because a lot of these accounts are viewable, or people know who they're attached to, like people know where Vitalik's account is, people know where Jimmy Fallon's account is, people know where Puma's account is, people know where Brian Armstrong's account is. There are either one or a few people that have been sending tornado withdrawals to their accounts. And my understanding of Ethereum is they do not have coin control or anything. So obviously with these systems, you can't stop someone from sending you something, but they also can't choose not to spend something. So there's all these extra complications that seem to be becoming very apparent here. And I would say, first and foremost, that these types of actions should not be unexpected by people. Like, governments around the world pushing back against financial privacy is a tale as old as time. Unfortunately, on both Ethereum and Bitcoin, but even more so on Ethereum, a lot of early decisions were made that make using them privately more difficult, but particularly on Ethereum, it's really, really bad. So I'm curious what happens here with this dusting stuff, how that is treated. But also on the flip side, anyone who has interacted with Tornado Cash with a doxed account before the sanctions happened is technically wrapped up in this as well. And regulated services presumably, at the very least, will blacklist them from interacting with their services, or we can expect that. And I don't know if we even, I would assume that the US Treasury isn't going to go after those individuals because we've never seen them go after users before, but they could, right?
And I don't think we need to expect them to do it logically. I mean, if they wanted to go after some of the people who've used Tornado Cash, and not all of them, that they can do that, even though it's dumb that it's not an evenly distributed judgment or no judgment. I wouldn't be surprised if they do go after some people, but not all of the people, and especially the people being dusted. Yeah, I mean, the issues with privacy on Ethereum are really damning in a case like this, as opposed to something like, if we contrast Tornado Cash and Samurai Wallet, for instance, and there's a lot of differences, obviously, but looking at them from like, how would someone even detect that you're using that specific tool? In Ethereum, like you mentioned, that contract address, or the contract addresses, because there are multiple for Tornado Cash, have been sanctioned and are obviously being surveilled now, and probably have been surveilled for a while. And so if you enter Tornado Cash, it's clearly visible on chain that you went from your account to the Tornado Cash smart contract. Yes, the funds then gain privacy after that, but the fact that you've chosen to use Tornado Cash is very transparent on chain. And also, as you mentioned, everyone reuses addresses in Ethereum because you generally just have an account and use that one. Another way that people link their identity or other NIMs to their Ethereum activities using ENS, so they're using those .eth addresses. And so they'll tie that to their Ethereum accounts, which again could be tied back to using Tornado Cash, past, present, or future. And there's a lot of issues with actually trying to be able to do something like that in an adversarial environment. Again, not advocating someone break these sanction laws, but just saying in this kind of situation, it's very easy to detect when someone tries to use Tornado Cash. Whereas with Samurai Wallet, even though you could see that they are entering a coin join, if you knew their specific address, like the user's address or a UTXO, you could see that they enter Whirlpool. But like you mentioned from the Samurai Wallet Telegram message, there's no static address or something associated with Samurai Wallet where they can tell that that's specifically a Samurai Wallet usage, and they can't just monitor Samurai Wallet themselves and see what transactions are flowing through Whirlpool and the other post-mix spending tools. So there are a lot of benefits to not only the UTXO model, but also the Tor first model of Samurai Wallet. There's a lot there. I guess the main weakness with something like a Samurai Wallet in a situation like this would be if they were forced to comply, they could turn over information associated with people who have not used their own dojo. They could turn over those XPubs, and some information about transactions could be given up. But again, that's very, very unlikely. That's just one of the downsides there, as opposed to within Tornado Cash, even the creators of Tornado Cash can't tell you what transactions are linkable between the entry and exit. But there are a lot of differences, and Ethereum makes it much more difficult to gain privacy, because even if you choose to gain privacy, it's extremely transparent that you have chosen to gain privacy on Ethereum.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we talk about specifically when we talk about like VPNs and stuff is this idea that it's impossible to prove if people are keeping logs. And it's kind of a similar situation with light client users on Samurai Wallet. Obviously, Samurai admits that they hold those XPubs for those users. They don't have them connected to an ID specifically. Obviously, it's connected to Bitcoin chain information, but they have, and it goes through Tor, so they don't have an IP address. But presumably, I have to imagine, I would hope, at least, at the very least, that they have precautions in place to make sure those servers are secure and to make sure that they are wiped in adversarial environments if they're compromised in some way. But yeah, that's probably like the biggest concern from any kind of action, whether that's an official government action or a malicious actor trying to compromise their servers and get that XPub information. And that goes for Samurai's obviously gets more flack about that than other projects in the space because they're a privacy focused project, but that goes for pretty much all Bitcoin light clients. If you're not using your own node, you're using someone else's node, and you're trusting who's ever running that node with your privacy and the validation of the Bitcoin rules, which is why it's so important to use your own node. That's one of, like, there's so many things to unpack here. The fact that it's so difficult to use your own node with Ethereum, makes this even more dangerous of a situation for them, I feel like. I mean, it just clearly does. It's not even a feeling.
Yeah, it's both the aspect of making it hard to run a node, but then also the combination of the address thing, right? So people getting dusted attacked right now, if they're really not still participating or have any association with actively, it's like there's no consent involved in that. You just received from a tornado address and you didn't do anything wrong. So like
but maybe Jimmy Fallon manually withdrew from Tornado himself. We don't know if someone else sent it to him.
Right. So they're probably, they have, I guess the United States has every they can at least question these people. I don't think they're I think worst case scenario for someone that was just innocently dusted, attacked in this way, they may be questioned, they may go through hassle, et cetera, but I think worst case scenario, they just end up having to like send as much as they received back to the United States, because there isn't this UTXO model that you can easily just like avoid these transactions. So I don't think they're like someone just innocently getting swept up in this is gonna like get in trouble, but it's probably going to be a pain in the ass to deal with it. Because like, and then what about the people that don't even know? Like, even in Bitcoin, we can detect a dusting attack a lot easier. I think Samurai even helps highlight when there's a potential dusting attack to your wallet. So like, shout out to them. But like, someone could just be naively receiving, these funds and not have any idea where it came from. They don't keep up with every address that's sanctioned, in Ethereum or other places. So like, yeah, there's probably going to be a lot of like knocking on the door for some of these people, and they have no idea what's going on.
And I think Seth made an interesting point on Twitter, which is, Seth, you make a lot of interesting points on Twitter, and I just lost the.
I was going to say,
point
I
that
made a
found
lot of
interesting.
points about Tornado.
Oh, okay. So, Tornado, for the Bitcoiners in the house, which is most of you, presumably, Tornado did something similar to what Wasabi did, and they proactively decided to incorporate chain analysis, chain surveillance, to prevent blacklisted accounts from interacting with their contract. And they were still sanctioned regardless. So I think there's a good lesson here in, proactive cuckery doesn't really protect you. Just hurts everybody.
Tornado was actively trying to prevent blacklisted addresses.
Yeah, about, I don't know, maybe 7 months ago now, maybe even be longer. They received pressure in some way that was unclear, and they implemented a chain analysis OFAC sanctions block tool essentially into their front end for Tornado Cash. So not into the smart contract, because again, they have no ability to edit that, but into their front end, which is the way the vast majority of people use Tornado Cash. They implemented this
Like the
free
website,
chain analysis
right?
tool, into the website. And all what that did was blocked OFAC sanctioned entities from using Tornado Cash. So OFAC has sanctioned Ethereum addresses before. That's not new.
And Bitcoin addresses.
Yeah, and a couple of Monero addresses and some payment IDs for some reason. But they blocked these specific OFAC sanctioned entities from using Tornado Cash, which in theory is all that the U.S. Treasury wanted, because the U.S. Treasury is claiming that the reason for this is to prevent North Korean hackers who are stealing funds within the Ethereum ecosystem from being able to gain financial privacy through Tornado Cash. And so in theory, that blocking of the front end from OFAC sanctioned entities would have been good enough, but obviously, I mean, we've seen this over and over again, giving in, like preemptively doing things to try to appease, just it doesn't work. And it's odd, because you think that the government would be happy with people doing that and want to incentivize people to preemptively comply. But it seems like yet again, they just preemptively complied and gained nothing from it, and now are still under the sanction hammer, and in a much harsher way than I think anyone expected, much less them.
That's really interesting, because like, if you read through the U.S. Treasury's official post that they made on this, I mean, you could read the entire article. There's a lot of really interesting language that they use here, but specifically to what Seth just said here, like that even surprised me. I didn't again know much about Tornado Cash, but the Treasury is specifically saying, and I quote, like, they repeatedly failed to impose effective controls. So it's not even that they didn't even try. It's like, well, they did try, right? But they're still making the claim that they like failed to do something that they were asked to do, even though it sounds like they tried. So like, maybe there's even I don't know, like warrant to getting this repealed in some way, or something along the effects. But I think that's really interesting that they at least tried to do something.
And I mean, even in Ethereum, like a static blacklist is very hard to be an effective tool to prevent a specific entity from using Tornado Cash. Like, that's one of the interesting things, is that I don't really know how they were supposed to effectively block it, because they can't change something in the smart contract, and they can implement this OFAC sanctions list. But I doubt that the U.S. Treasury was keeping the list up to date enough with every single account that these North Korean hackers were using. So it's really seems like a catch-22 where they want you to do this, but then you do it and it's ineffective, even though they're doing the things you say, and then you just get wrecked anyways.
Okay, what else do we want to unpack? The way I want to end it is, I mean, I want to have a discussion over, how Bitcoiners should act, like how Bitcoiners that care about financial privacy should proceed, impact on Monero. But before we get there, I just feel like there's a little bit more to unpack on the Ethereum side of things here. What else do we have? GitHub. Should we have a conversation about how GitHub is this centralized server? It's a centralized service for Git. Um, I I think an important takeaway here, when these things kind of happen, I think it's really important that people take them as learning experiences and we learn from them as much as possible, because the best way to learn is to live. So if we're living through these things, we should learn from them. And it's a it's a commonality that I've tried to practice throughout my time in the Bitcoin space. And so with all these things, the way I kind of look at it on a high level is everything has trade-offs, and ultimately people will always choose the most convenient option, or most people will choose the most convenient option. And usually when we look at trade-offs, there is a direct trade-off between convenience and privacy and security. And when we look at the Bitcoin privacy space, we see that trade-off in action. And you see these centralized blinded coordinators like Whirlpool and Wasabi that are making a convenience trade-off, that the trade-off is, there's a centralized entity that could be pressured by governments. And then you have something like Join Market that is significantly less convenient to use, that is made to be more robust. And from government regulation, pressure, centralized choke points. And I think it's prudent to realize that there's nothing inherently wrong, and it's probably the best decision in general to use, if you don't need, the full, most sovereign, censorship resistant thing at the time, then it's not necessarily a bad decision to choose something that trades that off a little bit for convenience. But you need to be prepared for a situation where you don't have the liberty of that convenience anymore, and you need to use the more robust option. You need to use the more sovereign option. And I think there's examples of this in multiple places with this tornado situation. One of them is the front end, which was accessible on ClearNet and hosted, I believe it was hosted on AWS. That makes a more friendly experience to people who want to use it. Now, it can presumably be run as a Tor Onion service and not hosted on AWS. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens going forward. Another aspect here is the GitHub repo. Git was designed to be distributed, that anyone could self-host it and you can interact with each other. But GitHub provides this nice central spot where everyone can communicate with each other. You have profiles, you have almost like a LinkedIn for devs type of situation. And people gravitate towards that, I would say, for convenience. I think you can map all of that stuff into convenience. With Bitcoin Core specifically, they mainly use GitHub for their communication. Well, not for all the communication and coordination around Bitcoin Core development. It is one of the main staples. But backups are kept, and theoretically, not even theoretically, in a situation where GitHub is censoring Bitcoin Core, they can move off of GitHub and they don't need to be relying on GitHub. And there'll be a convenience hit there. But they're capable of doing that. What do you guys think about that framing? Did I do a good job?
Yeah, and I think the convenience factor too. It's not. I well, the issues the issues quote like the GitHub tickets that are created, like bug reports and conversations and stuff. Those and pull requests are probably like some of the biggest lock-ins that really, I'm a developer myself, and of course I have a GitHub account, and I have code being hosted in in the GitHub repository, so like this, it's a struggle, but then it's also like I think it was a year ago or 2 years ago that I guess like the CEO of GitHub said something along the lines of I have complete confidence that if we were to take down the Bitcoin repository on GitHub, that everything will be fine. Like they would get along, everything will just keep trucking along just fine. And he got a lot of backlash for saying that. But I think he wasn't implying that he would take it down. He wasn't implying that that he wouldn't do it. He was just saying like, look, Git is still distributed in nature. The underlying protocol for pushing code, making branches, merging code, even. So if it was more of a testament to believing in the Bitcoin community that they have enough backups everywhere, that they have enough people that can coordinate outside of GitHub. You did say like a lot of coordination happens on GitHub. A lot of coordination also still happens in IRC as well. So it was kind of a testament that like, hey, look, like sure, GitHub is the most convenient option, and if they needed to take it down, they can host it somewhere else, and maybe they lose the issues, maybe they lose like the pull requests, but it's I don't know. Like I struggle with this, right? Like my preference as a developer is to continue using GitHub until I no longer can. For one reason or another, and then go coordinate in another manner and point my repository somewhere else. So that's like, in my opinion, my fail-safe. And now I do appreciate the fact that Samurai has, they started out that way too on GitHub, and then they said, okay, for redundancy reasons, let's host it somewhere else. And I think that was a great move, but I don't necessarily think it has to be the move. Like Tornado Cash, no, I'll stop there. But there's enough mechanisms for people to point code in a different location with enough confidence that like the code will continue on.
Yeah, there's the nice side of Git, which is the underlying tool and protocol that underlies GitHub, GitLab, Git, all of these different tools. They're just front ends for Git. And the fact is, everyone who has ever cloned Bitcoin Core's code has a copy of that, and anyone who is doing active development will have a current and up-to-date copy of that. So, like, even in the worst case scenario where GitHub takes down all the repos and there are no backups, every single developer will have a copy of Bitcoin Core's code on their computer, and many people who aren't devs will, just because they cloned it at some point. So there's, even in those worst case scenarios, there are recovery mechanisms. It would be tricky because you have to figure out what the actual state is you want to restore and start from, but it's definitely doable. But I think like looking at it from that perspective of having fail safes in place and being willing to jump to those if you need to. I think GitHub gets a lot of shade because they are owned by Microsoft, but it is an extremely effective service. And one of the very important things within free and open source software is the ability of getting other people's eyes on the code, getting other contributors coming in, and easing that process of people being able to contribute. And GitHub, with the traction that it has, if you choose to go to another service, if you choose to host your own GitLab or something like that, you're going to lose eyes on the code. You're going to lose contributors. You're going to lose people who would have stumbled across it or wanted to open a PR or something like that. And that's an unfortunate consequence of GitHub being such a central piece of really the open source movement as a whole. But there are lots of great alternatives that can be used. When GitLab was mentioned, that's what Samurai Wallet uses. There's a more lightweight front end for Git called Gitea, Gitea. That's really, really great, especially for self-hosting. Like I self-host an instance and I mirror all of my GitHub repos to my Git, and so it automatically keeps them all up to date and synced, so that if something happened, if my GitHub account was deleted and everything I'd ever worked on was gone, I'd still have a copy. It'd all be up to date, and I could just expose my Git instance and be good to go.
And they
So
have
there are a
that
lot of
as
ways.
a one-click install on Umbrel too.
Yeah, it's a really common software, and it's so lightweight. It runs great on a Raspberry Pi or whatever. It's an excellent tool. So it is important to have those alternatives, but I do agree with Tony that like stay on GitHub till you have to get off. Like I think that's a reasonable approach, and just making sure that you have those backups in place. I mean, I can speak for like the Monero project has gone through this same situation of not wanting to be dependent on GitHub itself and wanting to be resilient, and the Monero community explored moving to a self-hosted GitLab, but it was a big hassle to move all of the repos off and to get all the developers using it. And eventually just said, we're going to keep the GitLab as a backup. We'll keep it up to date and we'll continue using GitHub. And I think that's a viable method. And then there are great tools out there for keeping backups of not only the code itself, which everyone running Git and doing Git clone and all that would have the code, but they wouldn't have any of the issues, any of the comments, pull requests, where a lot of the meat of what happens in an open source project is. So having a backups in place that include those issues, include those PRs, and include all of that tertiary information that's not code, but is key to figuring out why things were done, when they were done, how the discussions went, is also a very important piece there.
Do we all agree that GitHub removing the repo was both the least surprising aspect of this whole situation and the least impactful aspect?
I was surprised by it. I'm not gonna lie.
Really?
I figured that they would just go after the smart contracts and the code would stay. I mean, I didn't expect the Tornado Cash people to go and deploy a smart contract or anything, but I didn't expect them to go after the code, and much less to go after the contributors themselves and to delete unrelated GitHub repos that were just created by the contributors who had contributed to Tornado Cash in the past. I didn't expect
they
that. They
deleted anything else they were maintaining, basically, right?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, and that's by order of the sanction as well. Anything that they own directly or indirectly, 50% or more, should also have been blocked as well. So, yeah, I agree with you, Matt. I'm the least surprised about this, the GitHub aspect of it too, because GitHub has done this before, and especially right after it was bought by Microsoft. In order, because like GitHub, Microsoft probably has better frameworks technically to comply with,
And then way more lawyers
and lawyers too, and the process is in place already for obeying all laws that they're in knowledge of. So they've done this before, and they've shut down accounts and they've shut down code.
They essentially
Iranians.
Yeah, they bought GitHub, and then like almost immediately following buying GitHub, they like banned all Iranians from the platform.
Yeah, and like
relevant projects.
It's tough. I don't think it's from malice on GitHub's side. It's like they basically have two options here. It's comply with the laws or try to fight back. And yeah, I just don't see them fighting back for just the the small cases that they're presented with. It's just way easier just to swat the flies than to really try to change the frameworks and laws in the United States.
Yeah, at the end of the day, they're a centralized multi-billion-dollar corporation.
Yeah.
Those types of corps tend to, if anything, over comply.
And can
proactively over comply.
Yeah, I want to bring up another point too on sanctions. And Super Fat Arrow, I see your comment as well. If you look more into like why sanctions exist and what they try to stop, one of the big aspects of it too is United States resources and United States financial rails and the U.S. dollar and things like that, right? Like all the things that the United States quote unquote owns, including its people and including the people that want to stay in good faith through the United States. That said, there was on the Ethereum thing that we haven't touched yet. There were a lot of stable coin, or I guess a lot. I think USDC was the main one. There, stable coins are inherently centralized as well, and the sanctions, even applied to them, so that they were able to go in and freeze all the USDC associated with this as well. So, like, the sanctions are, when you get into other countries using cryptocurrencies, well, like, that's not a United States financial tool, right? So I'm not going to say too much more on Iranians using cryptocurrency because I haven't read that article yet, but it's kind of designed to, like, prohibit Americans from doing something, prohibit resources that are United States owned, financial tools from the United States, and contributing towards a specific entity that they don't want using it.
So there's a couple of things here. First, the link that he commented about was what Superfat Arrow put in the Matrix chat, which is this Reuters report that came out yesterday that said Iran made its first import order using cryptocurrency. They insinuated in the report that it was an attempt to evade sanctions. That's probably an accurate insinuation. I mean, Iran is sanctioned significantly. The report states, it's pretty vague. The report says that the order was for $10 million worth of something. Doesn't say for what. And it doesn't say which cryptocurrency was used or how it was used. So it's a very basic report. It is interesting to me most that it happened on the same day that all the Tornado Cash stuff came out. So that makes it more relevant, I think, to this discussion than it would otherwise. I mean, I think people should assume that sanctioned countries are going to have more use for Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies than non-sanctioned countries because they don't have access to the traditional financial system. Specifically, if they're energy-rich countries like Iran or Russia, where they can also have access to mining, which gives them a permissionless way of accessing the networks to begin with. So that is something we've expected for quite a while. But to see it basically drop in the same days as the Tornado Cash stuff is definitely an interesting development. The other thing Tony mentioned, which is one of the last two things I have on my list on the Ethereum side of things that I wanted to unpack here, is Tornado Cash allowed you to use mixed assets, to use wrapped assets. And what that means is they allowed you to use USDC, centralized coin attached to US dollars held in a bank account by Circle and Coinbase, backed by Goldman and BlackRock, with Tether, and with WBTC, which is the same kind of product, but with Bitcoin held by BitGo. And all three of those, as soon as the sanction order went out, they got frozen by those custodians. So obviously, I mean, it's just a perfect example of why these this idea of wrapped assets is such a dangerous trust proposition. It's specifically the trust proposition that was attempted that was solved by Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, right? Where you don't have a third party holding an asset in a bank account, or if in Bitcoin's case on their keys, you have this native bearer instrument that you have full control over.
Yeah, and I think it's the only other thing you brought up Bitcoin. I didn't realize they were also involved in this as well. I wanted to just note that Bitco has been hit with fines in the past for not being as strict about sanctions in the past too. So specifically with Iran, I believe it was just a multi-sig that they helped assist with, so it wasn't even like a completely custodial thing. But that was, in my mind, like that set really interesting precedent for even being involved in a multi-sig and participating in a quorum and assisting with that when it comes to sanctions. So I'm not surprised that I didn't know they were involved in this, but I'm not surprised that they were really quick to act based on them getting hit with fines previously.
Yeah, I mean, this was particularly relevant to me because there's some outspoken members of Bitcoin Twitter who insisted to me many times that the best Bitcoin privacy tool was using wrapped Bitcoin and Tornado Cash. And this is a perfect example of wrapped Bitcoin not being Bitcoin and bringing in additional third-party risk. So that's why I pinpointed the wrapped Bitcoin situation pretty quickly.
Yep, it's basically just a custodian, someone else's keys.
Yeah, you have a custodian holding it, and they can freeze it at will. And then, do you have anything to add there, Seth, on the wrap side?
I don't think so. Sounded like y'all covered it well. It would be interesting to consider fediments from this angle, but I don't know if that's something you want to get into today.
I mean, I think fediments are highly relevant to this discussion. I think it goes hand in hand with what I said earlier about using a more convenient option if available to you, but if it's no longer available to you, then moving to the more sovereign option. I think fediments have a different strategy than Tornado Cash in that the goal is not, one large fediment, but it's anyone can spin up a fediment anywhere in the world. And they're all interoperable with each other, which obviously does make enforcement more difficult. And I think, when we were on your show discussing it, this is one of the key reasons why I said it's important that essentially, to me, fediments are dead on arrival if it's not easy for people to spin up self-hosted federation servers, fediment servers that operate through Tor and don't dox their IP address. And so it's a different strategy in this situation, which is basically almost like a whack-a-mole strategy, just that there'll be so many small fediments all around the world that are operated through Tor that it's like, it's hard to enforce in that level. And that's kind of, I don't think my thinking on fediments has really changed based on this development. But that's also probably because I was already more pessimistic and paranoid than most people when thinking about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think a little bit of when bringing up fediment and this kind of thing, it's more akin to, you can just consider each federation as its own service that it's providing, right? Its own custodian. So there probably won't be like a sweeping change that says like, okay, all fediment servers are now sanctioned. Like that's probably not what's going to happen, right? Because you could have like Coinbase could switch to fediment, right? Like so, it's like it's more of an implementation. Like who can sign up? Are fediment servers, if they get large enough, are they appropriately complying with all laws and regulations? Are they doing this? Are they doing that? Right. So like, it's not going to be a sweeping fediment is banned, or like anyone that's operating fediment software is like put on a list or is going to prison or anything like that. So I think it's all going to come down to implementations and policies, and then Matt, like you said, like if I'm a fediment server for just my family, right, that's a completely different story than like a fediment server that's like trying to operate globally. So I think it's going to be that almost just like shares any risk that any custodian really has. It's just yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen custodians get targeted in the past. Pretty much the assumption everyone should make is that any custodian that gets large enough will be targeted. We saw that the most recent large case was BitMEX. But I think we also, a lot of us overestimate how quickly regulators move. And a perfect example is, Wallet of Satoshi, which is a completely custodial Lightning wallet. That's been doing decent volumes and has lasted way longer than I expected without any kind of KYC. Now, that shouldn't be, I don't want that to be taken the wrong way. I still expect them to either implement KYC or shut down at some point. But the point is that's a single custodian that has full view of funds, that can rug pull at any time, that is being run by a known entity in Australia. So if you talk about a multi-sig custodian that can't see transactions, that needs to collude with each other, that can presumably be run anonymously, which is key, once again, to the whole thing to me, is that you're able to run these servers over Tor and self-host them relatively cheaply. You're just improving that status quo of what already exists. Then if that option is not workable in the current landscape, then you move to less convenient, more robust and sovereign methods, tools. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think the importance, like you said, of how easy it is to spin this up and how easy it is to do so in an adversarial environment will really dictate how useful something like Fed events could be. I mean, I think Tornado Cash sets an interesting precedent that maybe they could go after anyone contributing to something like Fediment at a
agree.
developmental level. They could take down repos. They could say that anyone operating an instance of Fediments is breaking sanctions laws because some Iranian or some North Korean uses Fediments to try to move funds. So I definitely think that is something to be concerned about and thinking about, because it could happen. And I mean, I think Tornado Cash is like, I would have thought that in like a worst case scenario before this, but I think it seems much more realistic that we have to think about them going after broad privacy tools and not just specific instances.
Well, I don't know. I kind of have to push back a little bit. I mostly agree, but I think like there's this distinction here that's important, and I'm not trying to justify certain rules and regulations that have been put in effect, but I think there is a difference when it comes down to software versus hosted software. Software that anyone can like run on their computer and utilize, like that's more akin to free speech, right? But when it comes to hosted software, as in even if it's hosted on Ethereum, if it's on a domain, if it's on a Tor address, if it's like wherever it's being hosted and people are interacting with it, like that can be quote unquote an illegal service or quote unquote something that could be sanctioned, right? But I think like there's a big distinction here between like what the Treasury service did, the U.S. Treasury did. And you could even argue like, okay, just because GitHub took down the source code, like the source code wasn't the problem. GitHub just had to take down the source code because it was owned and operated by a sanctioned entity. The software itself was not what was sanctioned here. And, and if Fedi, the company, well, I'm not even going to say it's an open source software, right? So that anyone can contribute to it.
Yeah, MIT license FOSS.
MIT license FOSS. It's not a hosted entity. It's not being hosted itself, right? So like I think there's a big distinction between running software locally and interacting with a hosted service that is running specific software in a specific way. So I have to push back a little bit on just the idea that like they're going like, yeah, they want to go after privacy tools, right? Yeah. But I don't think like just simply running or using software locally is the problem. I think it's interacting with hosted software that's more of a problem than local software that's open source. I just think that's like an important distinction to keep in mind here, not justifying one thing or another, but there is kind of a little bit of a difference between software as free speech and hosted software.
But I mean, I think if we look at Fediments, they're in a worse. It seems like they would be in a worse legal position than something like Tornado Cash. They are centralized and they are custodial. I mean, you could argue they're decentralized because it's a federation, but not
Sure,
really, because the federation members have to know each other.
it's each individual federation, right, as a hosted service, not the software itself.
But the same thing could be done with Tornado Cash. I mean, it wasn't. It was running on Ethereum, but anyone running an Ethereum node is running that smart contract and can interact with it at any point in time. Obviously, that's less people than like a Bitcoin node, but it's not as if it was a centralized, hosted, custodial tool. It's the opposite. And the fact that it is undergoing sanctions and its code and its contributors, I think, is something we need to be mindful of moving forward, for sure, and something we need to be considering how we build these things so that they can function in adversarial environments.
I think I agree with both of you guys. I think a useful example here to me is Signal Messenger. Or at least what I'm trying to get to make clear here is with the trade-off Signal makes. So Signal obviously allows you to easily and conveniently communicate with friends and family in an encrypted way. Now, I don't think, I personally think our laws protect using encryption, and they protect freedom of speech, and they protect privacy. But obviously, history has shown that we can't rely on those laws. I think it's relatively reasonable to expect a scenario where Signal essentially is made illegal in America. And there's been some narratives out of different members of Congress and rebuttals from Signal in that regard, and stuff in that notion, in that idea that, okay, if Signal doesn't implement some kind of backdoor, it's made illegal. In that situation, we still have FOSS tools available to us to communicate with each other in an encrypted private way. But Signal itself is obviously completely dead in the water, fighting a legal battle, hopefully winning the legal battle, right? So I feel like it's a good example of, if you're able to use a slightly more convenient tool, we have way more people using encrypted messaging than if they were using PGP. But at the end of the day, you're able to move to a more sovereign tool, and we have those tools available to us if the need arises in the future.
And practice those more sovereign tools before you need them, I think, is another big call out. Is you don't want to be blindsided and have no idea what you're doing when you enter that adversarial environment. So practice and understanding those tools ahead of time, even if you use the more convenient option, is important.
100%. And then that brings me to our last item on the Ethereum side, which is they are planning on moving to proof of stake shortly. There has been a lot of talk about the concept of freezing Ethereum that is being used in Tornado, similar to the way WBTC and USDC got frozen. And also, I've had some anti-freedom Bitcoiners call me out on Twitter asking the likelihood of CoinJoin Bitcoin, or Bitcoin that has some kind of collaboration transaction history on it, getting frozen. When we talk about these native assets getting frozen, not these wrapped assets that are held by a third party, we are talking about essentially what is a sophisticated mining censorship attack, where the miners who are including transactions in a block are coerced or forced or they collude with each other to not include certain transactions in a block, so you're not able to essentially send the Bitcoin or send the ETH. Now, Ethereum is currently still using proof of work. They have miners. The mining set is relatively distributed. In a world where Ethereum moves to proof of stake, I think there's very good reason to believe that those validators will centralize among regulated entities such as exchanges, Binance, Coinbase, Kraken. It is interesting to me that really, if, fortunately I'm not an Ethereum stakeholder, but if I owned Ethereum, to me, this should be like almost perfect timing wake-up call to abort the proof of stake transition. It seems like the Ethereum side is kind of just ignoring that aspect. Would you guys agree with me that this situation becomes an even more interesting scenario or even more dangerous scenario in a post proof of stake world?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, like you mentioned, the control over percentages of the network once proof of stake happens is going to rapidly shift towards centralized staking services. Not that they'll necessarily be dominant, not that one will have over 51% control or anything like that, but there will be at least a large percentage of the network in those centralized and regulated staking services. And so if this had happened after proof of stake, it would have been interesting if the U.S. Treasury had tried to pressure those regulated entities to prevent transactions that were to or from the Tornado Cash smart contract. Because in theory, they could. I don't know how slashing would work in that scenario. I don't know enough about the approach taken in proof of stake by Ethereum to know how the rest of the network would respond if there was a.
I think we're going to find out.
Yeah, it seems like it. It seems we're heading that way. Entering an adversarial environment and switching to proof of stake at the same time is a spicy set of things to combine. But it really will be the true test of if all of the proof of stake advocates have truth in the things they've been claiming, or if it's going to backfire in a massive way.
I've got a hot take too from Ben Carmen. He's being censored on Twitch right now.
Not by me. He's being censored by Amazon. He should
Probably
go into Matrix chat.
Yeah, he probably said Tornado Cash, and that's why it got censored. The F2.0 beacon contract on Ethereum was also created by coins from Tornado Cash too, so it's kind of it's an interesting aspect as well. But yeah, I agree. I mean, the Bitcoin.
Wait. The beacon contract was?
Yeah.
So that's like the original contract.
I think so, and I don't know exactly how that works, but that's his take. But going back to it, like I think you're right, and not only is it like does the power shift to large stakeholders, but it's like who those stakeholders are, and those typically like regulated cucks. So we're definitely going to see a big change, I think. I think it was Marathon a while back, the one that tried to censor transactions, and they walked that back.
OFAC compliant clean blocks.
Yeah, which is so funny too, because then like after enough hate on Twitter, they backtracked it. So it was like, what were you doing in the first place? Like you obviously didn't need to do that. So yeah, I agree. When the more regulated cucks that are controlling the chain, you're gonna see it massively change what they censor and what they don't censor.
And there's definitely some validity there on something that a lot of us have been very vocal about, which is that we don't want, too many large regulated US miners securing the Bitcoin network for a similar reason. Now, there is an interesting aspect of this mining censorship is that if a large group of miners are choosing not to include your transaction in a block, you can raise your transaction fee. Presumably, I mean, the same thing applies in a proof of stake system, all else equal. and you increase your transaction fee until it is included in a block. At that point, the miners who are attempting to censor that transaction have a choice to make. They can choose not to build on top of your block and essentially try and create their, a fork of that chain and build themselves. If they have a significant majority of the hash rate, that could be successful for them. It will be very expensive. Gets more expensive the less hash they have. On proof of stake with Ethereum, there is this slashing component that Seth mentioned. They are constantly changing how all of that works, and I do not have enough time in the day to pay attention to it.
What changes like 5 times a day.
But I will stand by my previous statement that it does appear that if they move forward with proof of stake, which it appears they are planning on doing full steam ahead, we will find out pretty soon how that all works out in practice. And it will be very expensive lessons for people, is my expectation.
Yeah, I mean the other saving grace here is that we're not going to change the Bitcoin transaction fee model, right? Like even if we like the whole idea of tail emissions and all that bullshit, like no one's going to be going along with that, right? But Ethereum, they change difficulty adjustments all the time, difficulty bombs. They change the ways the incentives work all the fucking time. So it's like if it became a situation where like a bunch of minor proof of stake fees were like coming from transactions, but then there were a lot of transactions being censored and money on the table, and like regulated institutions are just refusing to mine them. Like if it ever came down to like, oh, the proof of stake miners want more money, they'll just fucking change the code and everyone will go along with it, right? So it's like the incentives just don't line up, and they don't have solid foundations for how the incentive should be. And when with the rich people controlling the chain, they can just fucking change it at will.
And there's a key aspect here that I want to make clear. Here we're talking about protocol level censorship. Most 99% of the time, what we see is if you go for protocol level censorship, I would say is the hardest reach in all these situations. And usually when you see actions made, it focuses on the lowest hanging fruit, easiest things to enforce, impacts 90% of people, best bang for your buck type of situation. And that's usually by weaponizing the regulated services in the industry. So what I do expect to see play out here is people that interact with Tornado Cash, people that indirectly interact with Tornado Cash, are going to start seeing their accounts frozen, closed on regulated services. We've already seen that happen with collaborative transactions in the past. Services like BlockFi explicitly state you can't use CoinJoin before or after using BlockFi. So like when we go back to like the Jimmy Fallon dusting example, like I could see a world where Jimmy Fallon goes to deposit some ETH into Coinbase or withdraw ETH from Coinbase to his Jimmy Fallon account, and like Coinbase's automatic chain surveillance tool just flags his account, freezes it, and then he has to go through like a customer service quagmire for weeks or months. And because he's Jimmy Fallon, he'll probably get it reversed, but if it's just an average person, they might never get it reversed. So a lot of these pain points do kind of affect people that are focused on using these regulated services that connect with the traditional banking system. But it doesn't mean that if you don't interact with them, you're completely immune. It just means you're more resistant to those tactics than those who rely on them.
Yeah, it's much more likely that the regular person, whether they're just part of the dust attack or if they actually have used Tornado Cash in the past, they're much more likely to just run into fungibility issues, like you mentioned with coin joins. So I don't think they would need to worry about some kind of sanctions action against them. But we'll obviously have to see. But definitely the more likely one is regulated entities are gladly going to comply with a no-fact sanctions list. So if you have funds that have touched Tornado Cash, I'm curious to see what happens.
And just to go to show how messy this type of situation can be on these open ledgers, is like someone could go buy a sandwich with Ethereum, and the sandwich owner can then take that Ethereum and then send it to Tornado Cash, and that could still flag the person who was buying the sandwich, even if they didn't even know that Tornado Cash was being used by the recipient.
Yeah, and the cost of compliance is also really high too. So like sometimes, and not to justify some of the actions by some of these exchanges and custodians, but like sometimes it's like they don't want to have to deal with it. If like 0.1% of users are coming in with funds from Tornado Cash or whatever, it's just easier. It's probably just easier not even question a thing. Just say sorry, your account's closed. They have Coinbase has how many other millions and millions of users, they're not a problem case. So it's like, even just like creating support tickets or whatever, it's like costing them money and they're already a non-profitable business. So it's like, it's just easier just to over comply, not have to deal with customer support tickets and say like, sorry, you're high risk, and shut down their account.
Okay, so I think this was a very productive conversation. I'm glad we had it because I don't think many people will have it just because of the chilling effect of sanctions, and people just don't like talking about privacy in general because our society has groomed people to think that talking about privacy publicly is something you should be ashamed of or concerned about. But ultimately, Ethereum is a shitcoin that is built on very poor fundamentals, and I don't think can handle adversarial environments, and I think we will see that. So the question here is, for the before we wrap up this conversation, the question here is, what lessons should Bitcoin users, Bitcoin stakeholders, and Monero stakeholders take from this? And I throw Monero in the bucket because we have Seth here. And obviously because Monero is a group of stakeholders that are very focused on privacy.
I think a lot of the big ones we've already covered, but I think the key takeaways for me are build these tools if you're a developer or someone who's even just active in the community. Build these tools in a way that they can be resilient to adversarial environments, because I think we've been very spoiled over the last decade plus, where Bitcoin has really had a very easy path. Many people don't feel like that, but I think it really has had an easy path in usage and in adoption, and has not been in this type of adversarial environment before. So I think for the builders, make sure that you're thinking about how your tool, how your code, how your service can function in adversarial environments. And again, not specifically saying sanctions evasion, but in authoritarian regimes and countries that crack down on Tor usage, and in all of these different scenarios that we see worldwide, make sure that your tool has the ability to function in spite of those. For the average user, I think the big thing, like you also mentioned, is like, yes, use the convenient tool that also protects your privacy for now, but spend the time now before you have to understand what other tools are available and how to use them. So that if your favorite tool, I mean, if you're an Ethereum user and suddenly Tornado Cash is sanctioned, how are you going to gain privacy on Ethereum? Like, what is your approach there going to be? And you could approach that from the Bitcoin angle. If you use Samurai Wallet right now, but you're worried that Samurai Wallet somehow would get taken down or sanctioned or whatever, figure out a path towards what you can do for privacy on Bitcoin if you don't have that tool for some reason. So making sure that you have those options available, that you have that ability to keep your self-sovereignty and autonomy open no matter what happens to your favorite tools. And I think the last one is just not to let the propaganda and psychological pressure that goes with things like this get to you. I'm glad that I've seen a lot of responses on Twitter that are very focused on the need for personal privacy and how privacy is a right and is not a criminal thing. It's not something only criminals need. But just I definitely hope that people continue to keep their heads up, keep understanding why privacy is important, and don't let actions against privacy tools lead you to think that the fight for privacy is over, or that it's pointless. And I think we've seen the beautiful ways that both cryptography, the free and open source software movement, and cypherpunks have continued to push forward either alongside of or against the current legal system that they're in and the current environment that they're in. So I'm optimistic that's going to continue, and I'm thankful for all the tools we have at our disposal right now.
That was so well said, Seth. I'm not even going to attempt to add on to that. That was
yeah,
beautiful.
I mean, you
and I
nailed
can
that
use your
one.
time to talk about Monero. So
Well, before we do the so there is a similarity here, and it's a question I've been getting by people privately since this unfolded. There's a similarity here that if you use Tornado Cash on Ethereum, it's explicitly visible on chain. Like, it's very obvious if an account interacted with Tornado Cash. It is also, the similarity at play here is it's also very clear if someone uses collaborative transactions on Bitcoin. You can see them on chain. Now, there's some collaborative transactions like PayJoin, which are designed to look like normal transactions, but those provide more probability busting type of defense at scale, while coin joins are more explicit tools that are designed to break your own personal trail on chain, and they're very visible because they use equal outputs. So you can see them on chain, and someone used CoinJoin. So there's a lot of people out there right now that are thinking to themselves, is this a situation that shows me that I should use CoinJoin now, or is this a situation that shows me that I should wait and not use CoinJoin now? What would you say to those users, Seth?
I mean, I'm definitely a person who's focused on privacy, and I worry that if you don't need privacy now, you will in the future. So if you take that approach of I don't need on-chain privacy today, so I'm going to forgo the fungibility issues that go along with using privacy tools on Bitcoin, you risk the activity that you do today being something that ends up being harmful to you in the future. Because ultimately, once you make those transactions, you cannot take them back, and they're on a permanent immutable ledger. So that's the big deal with Bitcoin, and that's why. And I said this on Twitter in the past couple of days. I still advocate if you're using Bitcoin, you need to be using something like Samurai Wallet, and specifically Samurai Wallet is still my recommendation. But you need to be using privacy tools because otherwise your finances are just in the wind. Everyone can see them, and that could come back to bite you in the future. Obviously, there is some downside to that, and that downside really only comes with using centralized and regulated exchanges and tools like that. But that's the cost of the choices made with Bitcoin and the choices made for the protocol itself to be transparent by default and by design, and privacy being brought in an optional app layer. It works well when you use it properly, but it's visible on chain. Everyone, if you bought funds in Coinbase, you send them to your Samurai wallet and you mix them, Coinbase knows you're using Samurai wallet. It is very, very simple. The fingerprint is very clear. And that's just one of those downsides. It's clear that you're opting into privacy above and beyond what the regular Bitcoin user does, and that those are really just critical downsides of the protocol itself not being private by design, and that just comes with the territory. But for me, it is not worth the cost to not gain financial privacy today over just that fear of an issue with fungibility or funds being flagged or something in the future. And if you're really worried about that, what you need to be doing is learning how to use the decentralized alternatives to centralized exchanges, the things like RoboSats, the things like BISC, the places where you won't get funds flagged because there's not a central entity who's doing KYC, AML, and all this stuff who's going to be at kind of running the show there. So those things are important. I can also touch on like why that's one of the reasons I appreciate Monero's approach there, but I'll let Tony jump in before I get to that.
Yeah, I think that was well said. And the only other thing that I would add on to it is like, the thing that you maybe doing legally and fine today may be illegal tomorrow. And even if, you're still like, okay, well, I'm not going to, and this goes well beyond legality and things like that, right? Like, I'm not trying to say like you only need privacy if you're doing legal things, or not. But like, I think the point is like, laws change, like, cancel culture changes, like it's an ever changing landscape, right? And I think like, you should seek privacy as much as you can in order so you don't just get swept up in bullshit tomorrow. Even if you're doing something completely legit and no problem at all, like you don't want to get swept up in bullshit. And then like going back to like, okay, well, I just quote unquote tainted my coins by like being in a CoinJoin, and now I can't go back into Coinbase. And my only thing is like, well, what were you in it for in the first place? If it's just number go up and that's the only thing you cared about, then I don't know what to tell you. Like I didn't get in Bitcoin so I can go back into the financial rails. So that's my only thing.
Yeah, I mean, so from my perspective as a law-abiding citizen, there's something to be said here about the fact that my perception of our laws as currently stands in the United States, since I'm an American, and you should, apply that to wherever your jurisdiction is that using collaborative transactions for basic financial privacy is not a criminal act, is not an illegal act by itself. Now, our country has been known to pass unjust laws in the past. They might pass unjust laws in the future. And obviously, the stakes become significantly higher if you're using collaborative transaction tools if they are made explicitly illegal in the future. And where I'm going with that is to say, obviously, the main trade-off here is collaborative transactions are very visible on chain. Your usage of them is very obvious on chain. You might have trouble with using regulated services in the future. If you're comfortable with that trade-off, you get financial privacy today without explicitly breaking any laws. And there's a strong argument, I think, that this type of action in this direction shows that it's important to get your privacy in order before using certain privacy tools become explicitly illegal. And I hate having to watch my words when I talk about this shit.
Yeah, that is the fun part of publicly talking about these things.
So
it's
Seth,
tricky.
I have a great question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Someone on Twitter, Monero guy on Twitter, said that he's personally embarrassed that an Ethereum privacy tool got sanctioned before Monero. Thoughts?
The memes are good. I mean, there's the bit of it that I think is true, and like what we talked about earlier, where when something gets sanctioned, it shows that the U.S. government is both worried about the usage of the tool, so they see it as a threat. They feel impotent to solve it, obviously, because they can't just take it down. They can't just stop it. So when sanctions are taken instead of other legal action, I think it is an interesting tell that at least the U.S. government sees the tool as working pretty well. So, I mean, in some ways, it is interesting that something like Monero hasn't been sanctioned yet, but I think that's also another one of the strengths that comes with the entire protocol being privacy preserving. And so if they want to sanction Monero, they can't just sanction a specific app that some people use within Monero. They have to sanction the entire decentralized network, the entire protocol. And that's a very difficult thing to do.
So you don't think Monero will be the target of this type of financial action in the future?
I definitely would not be surprised to see something like this, mostly for the psychological effect. Again, like we talked about earlier, I think the main reason to do something like that would be to dissuade quote unquote compliant citizens from using something like Monero because they're worried about the implications for them legally. So I think that would be the main reason why something like that would be done. But the simplest route for them is what they've been doing, which is continue to constrict the easy ways to get access to Monero, getting it delisted from exchanges, using regulatory bodies, not laws, but regulatory bodies and banking ties to prevent exchanges from being able to easily support Monero. So I think that's the easiest path for them right now, and the easiest path to dissuade the regular person from getting access to Monero and using it. But if Monero's usage continues to increase, especially in places that they don't like, I wouldn't be surprised to see it. I mean, it's growing in usage in darknet markets. In the past, it has been linked, at least mining of it has been linked to North Korea. So yeah, as it grows, as people understand what it does and what it does well, I wouldn't be surprised to see some sort of legal action. But this is precisely the environment that Monero has been designed for. Not, again, sanctions evasion, but this concept of an adversarial environment and ensuring that in this worst case scenario, in an oppressive regime, in an authoritarian regime, Monero is built as much as possible to be resilient. And so all of the different trade-offs that go into effect, the pros and the cons, make it something that I think is extremely resilient in an adversarial environment and is prepared for this. I think Ethereum is quite the opposite, where it's built by developers who are optimistic about the future and want to build something that is kind of building for the best case and not for adversarial environments. And I think Bitcoin is definitely more towards the Monero side of things and has been built for adversarial environments. But I think that, I mean, you've talked about it a ton on the show. I've talked about it a lot. I think that the privacy piece has been missed and has very sweeping implications for how effective Bitcoin can be in adversarial environments. So that's why I think, like, I wouldn't be surprised to see some action against Monero, but it is very resilient and in some ways even more so than Bitcoin. And so it would be interesting to see what that type of sanction would mean for Monero and its usage. But I wouldn't be surprised to see something like that in the future.
Does your view on the path forward for Monero as a project change based on this Tornado Cash situation?
Say that one more time. Sorry.
Does your view on the path forward for the Monero project, has it changed based on this tornado situation?
No, not at all. Like I mentioned, I think this is what has been in mind when building Monero and when building out the ecosystem around Monero is what does it look like for someone to use Monero, buy Monero, etc., under worst case conditions. And so I think that the project has been well pointed towards this goal and has been built for this kind of use case. So I don't think there's much to really change at this point. I mean, even like the specifics of this, Monero has been prepared for years for GitHub takedowns or anything like that. Mining decentralization is improved through commodity hardware mining, so they couldn't sanction mining hardware. It's improved through on-chain privacy, so they couldn't see specific transaction details and try to censor specific transactions, although they could try to enforce mining empty blocks. But again, that gets very difficult because the miners aren't large-scale industrial regulated miners. There are a lot of aspects of Monero, again, that they've been built for this. Like this is what has been in mind by the people who have been working on Monero for the last 8 years now. So I don't think there's any need for a big shift there. And I think a lot of the things that have been seen as excessive or unnecessary in Monero's approach, I think will rapidly be seen as smart. And yes, they have trade-offs that do have drawbacks, that do have associated risks. But I think people will start to understand why the Monero community has made the choices it's made in the project's direction over the last 8 years, even though we've been in a non-adversarial environment for most of that time.
Yeah, there's something to appreciate about that aspect of it, right? Like, it's not the most convenient option, and people realize that it's not the easiest to use. It's not the most widely available thing, and people have figured out a way, and people are using it in the ways that they can, and in a pretty good private way. Like, a lot of ways I wish we could just like rip the fucking Band-Aid off and on Bitcoin and just say, like, okay, like we're not trying to be using these regulated custodian so much. We're not playing this happy-go-lucky world where everyone just like cares about number go up. In some ways, I wish we would just rip that Band-Aid off, but it is what it is currently.
I mean, if we don't rip the Band-Aid off, like the Band-Aid's going to be basically ripped off by others. No, like, I mean, a lot of.
Yeah, I mean, however the Band-Aid gets ripped off, let's someone rip it off. Like let's quit playing that.
I mean, like Super Fat Arrow makes a good point in the Matrix chat, right? Which is something that I've said for a while, which is the single largest attack on Bitcoin has been extremely successful and has been ongoing, and that's KYC, AML, identification on all of these regulated services. And as a result, then those identities are linked on chain and then tracked through the system, hurting everybody else. When we look at the type of attacks that are possible on users trying to achieve financial privacy when using Bitcoin, most of the attacks, especially the low-hanging fruit stuff, revolves around blocking access to those regulated services. And usually those regulated services are where you're connecting between the fiat world and the Bitcoin world. Monero already lives in that situation. Like Monero already, like how many bank exchanges offer Monero, Seth? Just Kraken?
If we're talking US, we're only Kraken at this point.
Yeah.
Yep.
So when we're talking about like worst case scenario for Bitcoin privacy users is like, okay, so they can't use 99% of exchanges. You can't do that on Monero already.
Yeah, I mean, you can still at this point, but I do think that will likely continue to change. But yeah, we kind of have never had the chance to have a Band-Aid.
So, I mean, I wonder, like, what I kind of expect to happen is like to see like almost like a bifurcation of the network in the short term, or like medium term, which basically like there's Bitcoin users that use it in a self-sovereign way, that use it privately, that don't interact with the BlockFis and the Coinbases of the world. And then there's this whole other subset that is this whole other group of Bitcoin stakeholders that are basically using it in this regulated environment.
I do want to push back a little bit on that idea that if we don't have KYC AML, Bitcoin is fine and we don't need to worry about that. So exchanges are the only risk. I mean, even in that scenario, if you're going to use a currency, you're going to use it in person. You're going to use it to buy things that may connect to your ID in some way. If you're running a business that's using Bitcoin, you're going to pay suppliers. You don't want people seeing that info. So it's not like removing KYC removes all of the privacy flaws with Bitcoin.
It's definitely not everything. It just makes everything so much more complicated when talking about a privacy perspective.
It does, and it provides broader pseudo anonymity than otherwise is possible with KYC. It makes at least that fragile pseudonymity not broken instantly.
I guess like my perspective on it is like, so we see in the digital privacy world so often that all it takes is one mistake. And that one mistake is usually what gets you, right? And you see this in the high profile cases all the time. And it's not just Bitcoin or cryptocurrency or Monero. It's everything on the internet, right? We have that term like the Streisand effect, where Barbara Streisand tried to remove a photo from the internet, and instead the photo got reposted everywhere. And so with when it comes to blockchains, obviously that's on steroids because we expect the Bitcoin ledger to outlast all of us if it's successful. Like this thing's immutable, shared around the world, transparent, and is expected to last forever. If you make a mistake on there, you're not going to be able to remove that mistake. Now, when we talk about the little mistakes that people tend to make, a lot of times that comes down to some kind of connection to KYC. And that is just that's basically where I'm coming from here. And like the Bitfinex hacker, the richest rapper of all time, is a perfect example of that, where they were buying gift cards, and it was attached to their real life identity, their legal name.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Like, Bitcoin isn't sufficient enough. Like, if when we use Bitcoin connected to our identity, we're doing it wrong. It's almost like the example case that you brought up, Matt, where like if you go to a sandwich shop, your identity is right there, right in front of the sandwich shop owner, right? So I wouldn't go as hard and fast as Super Fat Arrow is here, but he's on the right track. Like, KYC AML is the illicit activity here. But we still need, Bitcoin privacy to be a lot better.
Yeah, I mean, I will 100% co-sign that, and I think I've been a big proponent of it. I think Bitcoin privacy tools have improved tremendously over the last few years. I think they need to continue to improve, and I think they need to get easier to use, and I think time is of the essence.
Agreed.
Awesome. Okay, it's been a great conversation, boys. Let's wrap up with some final thoughts. Seth, final thoughts.
Ooh, always hard to go first. I think final thoughts for me are just I don't know. I've touched on it so many times already, but just learn the tools. Get ahead of the game. We are heading towards an adversarial environment, and anybody that wants self sovereignty, that wants autonomy, is going to need to be able to leverage the power that has been given to us through cryptography and through open source code. And so, learning to harness those tools and use them to benefit you and your family and your loved ones is going to be more and more vital over time. So just go ahead and start today. I mean, that's why I love Citadel Dispatch. It's actually actionable, and there's a lot of stuff in here that you can take and start to make changes to your usage of Bitcoin and other tools today. So I think that's really the takeaway here. I mean, obviously we talked a lot about Tornado Cash and other privacy tools, but just important to have an understanding of those and have alternatives in case the one that you happen to be using or something that you like gets shut down. You need to be able to switch and to switch over again, not just yourself, but hopefully your family and the people you love, and bring people with you on that journey.
Awesome. Thanks again for joining, Seth. I appreciate you. And to all the freaks out there, if you like listening to Seth, he has a fantastic podcast. Just search Opt Out Pod on your favorite podcast app.
Thanks for the shout out.
Yeah, of course. Tony, final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, like, Seth is hitting the nail with the hammer here. He's doing a phenomenal job. I almost don't need to say anything at all, but I will echo that point. Like, don't be scared by all the privacy stuff or like quote unquote takedowns and enforcements against it. Keep learning. It's Bitcoin's always going to be a changing landscape. All of the laws and enforcements and everything are ever changing. So just keep learning, keep going at it, keep pushing yourself forward with the tools that you use and the things that you learn. And yeah, just a shout out to like shows like Citadel Dispatch that are out there helping educate people.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony. I want to thank our guests a second time for joining me on short notice to talk about such a sensitive yet important topic. To all the freaks out there, thank you for continuing to support the show via sats or subscribing or joining the live chat. I love all you freaks that join the live chat. Cortic, we've seen all your comments. I love that you're here participating. We have two more. I have two more Citadel dispatches set up for this week, both on Friday. We're going to have Sid in the studio. We're going to be talking about grassroots Bitcoin adoption. He drove his motorbike around the country, going to all the different Bitcoin meetups. And then I'm going to have Rockstar in the studio later that afternoon to talk more on this subject and to talk about a variety of things. Rockstar is always an interesting character to have on the show. So if you haven't subscribed already, open your favorite podcast app, type in Citadel Dispatch, click the subscribe button. That auto download button really helps as well. And then if you like the video stuff, pick your favorite platform, whether that's Twitch or YouTube. Or Bitcoin TV. If you subscribe there, you get notified. On Bitcoin TV, you do not get notified if you click subscribe, but they're all streamed there. But if you subscribe on YouTube or Twitch, you'll get notified. And the archives are also posted to Rumble and Telegram. With all that said, I do appreciate you all. Stay smart out there. Stay humble. Stack sat.